name is Tessa Hicks Peterson. I'm director of CASA, Critical Action and Social Advocacy, which is a community engagement and community-based research program of Pitzer College. And our program is hosting the speaker series. So about every Tuesday, we have a new speaker, activist scholars and community leaders who are talking about different social justice issues that they are working on. And so we've talked about the critical pedagogy and mentoring. We've talked about immigration. We've talked about autonomous zones and borderlands research. We've talked about labor organizing and just generally a variety of different ways that people are looking at different social justice issues that impact us collectively and regionally, as well as in particular how racial justice and healing justice inform those practices and that work. So we're really excited to continue our series today with Susan Phillips. A little background knowledge is that Susan Phillips was the director of this program, CASA, back when it was called Pitzer in Ontario. She directed this program for many, many years. And then about maybe a dozen years ago, she was also the director of the Community Engagement Center at Pitzer College. And she handed the reins over to me to be the director of the Community Engagement Center a dozen years ago. And then just a couple years ago, handed the reins over to me to be the director of CASA. So I have been following in Susan's footsteps. She hired me 15 years ago at Pitzer. So I am indebted to her and have been working with her for many years, but also very much a fan of her really deep work on issues of gangs and policing in prisons in California. So I will let Sonia get a little bit more into that in her introduction, and then away we'll go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tessa. And I feel very honored to be able to introduce Susan Phillips today, who is an American anthropologist and criminologist who works as a professor of environmental analysis here at Pitzer College. She is known for her research on graffiti and her books on gangs and graffiti. Phillips graduated in 1990 from California State University, Dominguez Hills, with a bachelor's degree in civilizations. She then went on to UCLA for graduate study in anthropology, earning a master's degree in 1994 and completing a PhD in 1998. After continuing at UCLA as a lecturer for 4 more years and also working as a lecturer at the Art Center College of Design, she became an assistant professor at Pitzer College in 2002. In 2016, as an associate professor, she was named a Getty Scholar by the Getty Research Institute. And please all join me in welcoming Susan Phillips today. A warm Zoom welcome. Yay!
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's so funny. I can recognize the Wikipedia page, which is so weird. I found recently that I had a Wikipedia page, and I was like super excited about it. And then it described me as an American criminologist, which I've been like, whoa, like I've never, yeah. And then even going into like my background with a BA in civilizations at Cal State Dominguez Hills. So it's a very odd way to phrase the major, but the backstory there is that I made it to like my senior year of college without figuring out what I wanted to do. Like I had no clue. I took classes in music. I took classes in like theater. You know, I took classes in art, archaeology, anthropology, biology. Like I just loved everything. I couldn't imagine like actually making a decision about a major. And so at the school, unlike at Pitzer, you know, you can make up your own major, which I probably would have done, and it would have made no sense. There were a number of categories of made up majors, and one of them was called civilizations. And so I ended up bringing that, but like it was mostly a major that was basically a combination of art history and anthropology. And in a sense, that combination is still what drives me. And it's still foundationally like informs what I do. And like everything about me goes back to this one moment at Cal State Dominguez Hills where, cause you know, I was from Southern California and I went to school about 20 minutes from my house. You know, I basically learned to driving from my house to Cal State Dominguez Hills because I was 17 years old when I started college. I had a license. I couldn't even vote, and I was starting college. I got my license the minute that I turned 16. Like, it was 2 days after I turned 16. I was just like, growing up in the suburbs, I was just like, I gotta get mobile, So I got my license, drove back and forth to Cal State Dominguez Hills. Anyway, by the time I was in a junior senior mode or whatever, I was living on campus. And what ended up happening was I was in a sociology of education class, and and the teacher used to call me Dr. Phillips because there's a famous anthropologist named Susan Phillips, and she studies the Warm Springs Indians, and she wrote her seminal article in 1977 about like different learning styles and all this stuff. So he used to call me Dr. Phillips, and I got a lot out of this class. I don't remember anything. I liked it, but except for the one day when he taught us one gang symbol, and he basically said, he taught us what the number 13 was. And it was this gang symbol, and it stood for it was a replacement of number to letter replacement, and it was, it stood for the letter M, and he said that the letter M stood for Mexican, and that was what the 13 meant. And when he said that, it was just like a bomb went off in my mind. Because I had been until then really interested in the history of art, and really interested in like how art and society were interlinked. And I was looking for the sort of really intensive links that I was seeing in other societies outside, in global societies, that I couldn't find it. I was like, is it in the museum? Like, is it film? Is it advertising? Like, where does art and society really come together in this like visceral kind of life and death way? And I couldn't figure it out, for my own society that I was living in. And then, and the kinds of art I was most interested in, and believe me, this actually does have a point that I'm trying to make, that the kind of art that I was most interested in was, and my brain was most attracted to, was the kind that had to do with like puzzles, decoding, deciphering encoded symbols, kind of like the Dan Brown. It was before Dan Brown, but it was kind of like the Dan Brown thing, like, oh, and a lot of the history of art is full of like, oh, if you see a palm frond, it means there's a martyr nearby. Or if there's a pool of water, it stands for purity. Or when you see a dove, it's the Holy Spirit. I'm totally not a religious person, but I love, and I still love to this day, religious symbolism that's kind of hidden and encoded into works of art, especially into works of art that are then for public consumption. How did they tie society together? And I became very interested in the art of the Northwest Coast, in terms of the way that clanship, these major social divisions were represented by certain symbols, layered upon, on top of each other, or hidden in certain ways, in larger compositions, so that you could like pull out the threads of which clan was using what symbol and how they were related to each other just by looking at the artwork. And that's what was fascinating to me. Like, I loved that process, and I never ever wanted to study gangs ever. Like, I was never like, oh, that's interesting. I was never like that. I never had like an attraction to studying gangs. I was ready to become a classical archaeologist or, whatever. So what ended up happening is that day in that Dr. Edward Bruner's class, where he taught about the 13, and the 13 became this kind of like turning point for me of realizing that there actually were groups in the United States that shared, that had that visceral connection between art and social life that I had been looking for and that I had been wondering about. And it turned out to be in gangs. And so I was always a photographer. I've always been a photographer, even since I was a little kid. And so I ended up embarking on this project. And this was when I was about 20. I started, well, actually, I think I had turned 21 by the time I really started to do gang graffiti. So started looking for gang graffiti everywhere, taking every photograph I could find of gang graffiti, and literally learning from the graffiti itself, like how to read gang graffiti, because a lot of it is it's self-referencing. So you can learn how to read it and never talk to a person, right? So I would go around taking pictures, getting the lay of the land, trying to figure stuff out. But the fact of the matter is that you can't actually do that kind of work and not talk to people, right? And you can't actually start to think about, oh, I'm just going to study gangs and like art. Like it doesn't work because of the many, many social justice issues that surround gang neighborhoods and gang members and their families and their communities. And so that was the process that I ended up coming to, not in a way that was not intentional. It was accidental. Like I literally was attracted to this one very esoteric thing that had to do with deciphering or encoding and the importance of social life and art, that fusion. But because of the fact that gangs occupied this certain place in society, it didn't stop there for me. It just was a beginning. And so it became the beginning of my career, essentially many years of 30 years actually of being involved in having relationships with gang members and their families, and in neighborhoods where people who had my positionality, as a white middle class female, I was very young when I started, normally wouldn't like be in neighborhoods in Los Angeles that were gang neighborhoods. And so I ended up thinking a lot about my own positionality before I even knew the term. So back when I started in the early 90s, and I think Tessa would probably vouch for me here, we did not have the sophisticated discourse that you all have and that you've learned from Tessa and that you've learned at CASA. We did not have that. We had nothing like that, especially within anthropology, which is what I ended up getting my graduate degree in. We had a methodology that was called person-centered ethnography, where really you focus in on the life of a person and you think about your relationship to that person in ethical terms, but really not through the lens of your positionality or power relationships in your own society. Because if you think about it, most of the time, anthropology, especially at that time, was taking place outside of the United States. So the ethical terms on which anthropology was practiced were totally different. It had a completely different history. If I had been in sociology, I'm sure I would have had a number of other kinds of introductions and lessons to that sort of thing. But there was just a very different understanding of race and class and positionality at the time. Those conversations just did not exist. Where I learned that stuff, okay, was on the street. And I learned it from the people that I was working with, the people that I was talking to, and the folks that, kind of brought me into their lives, and we were in each other's lives. And I learned all that stuff before I even knew what to call it, and literally it was only after, like, I don't know, maybe five years at Pitzer College, I think, or maybe even 10, that I first heard the word positionality. Like I never even knew. Like it just wasn't used. So these are relatively new, kind of nuanced ways of thinking about power in relationship to research that were underdeveloped conversations at the time. So in that sense, that kind of brings me to, I guess I wanted to give you a little bit of a history of like, okay, what my background is in this work, because if I don't do that, the first question from everyone is always, how did you wind up doing this? And you very pointedly being like, you as a white chick, and so that's what I kind of wanted to explain that at the time. had a very different face, a very different shape, a lot of pain, a lot of pain in learning those lessons on the street. I just I was so clueless. It was ridiculous. Like I never had the education that we, Tessa and I, have tried to build at CASA. Like I never had the luxury of that. And if I had, I quite frankly never would have done the work. So because of that awareness, I probably would have said, that's not an appropriate project for me. And so, but here it is 30 years later, and I have done the work, and and I used to be very afraid of conversations about race. So in particular, the alignment of this talk with the Racial Justice Initiative, for a long time, I was unable to figure out how and if it was ethical for me to be doing the work that I was doing. And I actually wrote, I think, half of a book that was never published because I could not see my way to writing something for the public that I felt was unethical. Okay, that I could not see a way forward through that. And so what I wound up doing instead is writing this book, Operation Flytrap, that was not the kind of ethnographic, like, oh, white woman does work in the projects, which is actually what Alice Goffman ended up doing. I don't know if you're still reading Goffman. She ended up doing that and getting all kinds of flack for it, right? Immense problems coming out of that in terms of her way of positioning herself in that work. I chose not to do it. I chose to embark on a much, much more specific project that had to do with the relationship of gangs and the police. And I'm kind of shortchanging the history a little bit. Like I wrote my dissertation and my first book on gang graffiti, and then 10 years later ended up publishing this book called Operation Flytrap, which is about an FBI sweep. And in part, that book and that project enabled me to come back to the story that you all read about, which is about this horrific, murder and assassination and so forth. And I want to pause there and return to that story and entertain your questions. And kind of like, I actually did end up thinking a little bit about what did I want to share with you about my knowledge of gangs and what I have come to understand about gangs as like social groups in the broader milieu of our very, very unequal society. Tessa, am I missing anything here before I move on to that part? I may have left like 5 threads undone there.
No, I think it's great.
Okay. I will share my screen with you. Let me see if I can actually do that. Okay. So, can you see the screen? Yeah. I wanted to start here. Like, where do we understand the roots of gang violence, and how do we begin to understand gangs as these sort of geographic entities? And, the whole time I was doing active gang research in terms of thinking about graffiti, which is a particularly spatial kind of data. If you think about it, it's always embedded in place. And gang neighborhoods are very spatialized. They're very, very tied to certain landscapes. And so thinking about the idea of that there's an alternative cartography that kind of governs the city. And then it's once again one of these things that's sublimated, it's sort of hidden. If you don't know the categorizations, you don't know, oh my God, is that Glenn Rice? Glenn, amazing. Do you remember Glenn, Tessa?
Yeah, he was in my first CASA class I ever taught 14 years ago, the very first class I ever taught.
Oh my God, amazing. Hello, it's so nice to see you. Oh my gosh. Thanks for coming. Um, oh my God, this is so exciting. It's so wonderful to see alums. Um, okay, so but back to the talk.
Susan,
Here you are.
I can't see the key, the legend. Can you tell us what the colors mean? Because it's too hard to see the legend of what the colors mean.
Yeah. Yes, I can explain. This is in other words, okay, so just back to the idea there's an alternative cartography that exists in Los Angeles and in any, you know, in any, honestly, any city that has gangs in it. Where does that come from? Where does it originate from? And in this is the HOLC map, the Homeowners Loan Corporation map called the Redlining Map. And I'm not going to explain redlining other than to say it was a rating system also based in geography that had to do with who was a poor risk or a good risk to receive loans. And there were areas that were green lighted. If you notice Beverly Hills, can you see my cursor going around? Can someone just say yes or no? Yes. Yes. Okay. So thank you. They're green lighted areas, and usually that meant that they were very stable. Okay, it means that they're very stable areas and that there aren't other kinds of like nefarious influences. So Beverly Hills had stable housing, it had good housing stock, and it had quote unquote good people, usually meaning white. Okay, then you had, and that was considered a first grade, the green. The second grade was considered blue. And these were areas that were pretty stable, but maybe they had, you know, I don't know, maybe there were some other things that were compromising. Sometimes real estate risk has to do with change. Like maybe there was a hint that things were changing a little bit that made it a poor risk. Third grade, again, you're getting into a zone here where basically there's danger signs, and the danger signs have to do with people of color, and the danger signs have to do with mixing, racial mixing, for example. If there's too heterogeneous of a neighborhood, they would give it a yellow rating. And then the redlined areas were like absolutely no go. And any presence of any African American in any community was an automatic red. Okay, so talking about the history of racial inequality, one of the most important pieces of that history has to do with segregation, and it has to do with housing. Okay, where were people allowed to live? There were very strict lines. I'm sure you've all heard of racially restrictive housing covenants, that these were eventually struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, and so they were disbanded. This map also, these types of maps exist all over the United States. And these redlined areas became areas where both there was housing sequestration, meaning you're Black and you have to live, for example, in this area here, which is the area where I did the work. It's the area that where the murder that I wrote about takes place. That those areas are very rigidly categorized. So I want to zoom forward to this. If anybody has questions about that, feel free to ask me. But this is a basic redlining map. These maps were kind of outlawed at a certain point. And actually, who was doing the mapping? It was like real estate people, you know, who had a lot of vested interest in seeing things certain ways. And if you look at the data, there's wonderful public website, Projects T Races, it's called, that you can look up, you know, any one of these areas, and it'll give you the data for that area. And to do that, which I do routinely with my urban environments class, is absolutely horrifying to see the way that they would describe people, and the way that you know, for example, any percentage of Negro population was considered hazardous. The other idea that there were subversive racial elements within neighborhoods. So the language is all right there. It's very shocking to us now. It was very normal at the time to think about that. So if you zoom forward, and this is, for those of you who don't know, obviously a map of Los Angeles. If you go forward to 1992, where there's this crisis of, and this is like the year after or a couple years after I started my field work, there's this sort of crisis of gang violence, you know, coming out of the 80s, coming to a head in 92 with the Los Angeles uprising. And this is the district attorney's map of Los Angeles. So you see a similar kind of rating system in a way, where you see very heavy gang activity in these red zoned colors, moderate and yellow. Then there's the green, and this is kind of like very light gang activity in neighborhoods that might have a couple gangs here and there, but that you know, that weren't enough to like be have this notice of. The thing that I noticed right away in terms of thinking about it from a, you know, cartographer's perspective is if you link these things side by side. Now these are at slightly different scales, but you get, this is a closer in map over here, the HOLC. This is the area where I did my field work, the Central Avenue district, versus that same district is right here. Okay, so you get this idea of East LA being over here and East LA, where the heaviest gang concentrations in some cases are in neighborhoods that are formerly redline neighborhoods. So that should come as a surprise to nobody. It's sort of like this structural account of housing, inequality, race that has to do with the generation, you know, and like the development of neighborhoods that end up becoming you know, ripe for gang formation. And in the gang literature, there's kind of this narrative that gangs are this epiphenomenon of deindustrialization, you know, economic restructuring in the 1970s. Like that's where gangs come from. But in terms of looking at the actual history, if you go a little deeper, you get the idea that gangs have their origins, you know, a lot earlier, and that a lot of it is embedded in local policies, in state level policies, and in federal policies that have to do with housing in particular. And so what this did was when they did these redline maps, it played into another kind of mapping project that was going on at the time that had to do, and this is Pueblo del Rio housing projects right here on the fringe of this, where the story that I tell takes place of Amon's execution. In the tandem project that had to do with like this narrative of progress, okay? Had to do with the identification of slum housing. So the identification of slum housing took place all over Los Angeles, but certain pockets were identified because the housing authority wanted to find land on which to build housing projects that they thought would be the key to kind of a clean life, you know, that people could be proud of those residences. You know, that they, and to this, you know, to be fair, if you actually do look at the quality of housing, there's some seriously problematic places, you know, that in terms of, you know, people not having access, and but there's more than that. There's narratives about lack of sanitation, for example, that get rooted in and mixed in with racial discourses to say this is a slum. So when I look at these houses, I'm not seeing a slum, okay? But these were exactly the kinds of photographs that led to the designation of that area that I was pointing out to you in the late 1930s, early 40s as being designated as a slum. All these houses were razed to the ground. And the funniest part about it, I should have shown this photograph actually today, but I didn't think I'd be going into this much detail. The idea is that you have to prove that it's a slum. So what did the person do? And I actually happen to know who the photographer was, and he took a lot of pictures of gang graffiti in 1974. But one of the things he did when he was working for the Housing Authority, this is Leonard Nadell, is he took pictures of alleys. He would go into alleys and take pictures of houses from the back and say, look what a slum this is. Now from the front, look, everybody's house has what I call an ass end to it. Like there's always parts of your house that like nobody sees, where all the crap is shoved to the side. That's essentially what he was doing in order to prove that these areas were slums. So out of Pueblo, what had been this neighborhood, was built these modern apartment-like and very park-like areas designed by famous architects, Richard Neutra and Paul Revere Williams, who's arguably one of the most famous African-American architects in the United States. They were on the team that designed Pueblo del Rio. So Pueblo del Rio, and this essentially is what the projects look like. This is where the Pueblo's gang is. And actually, I think I left all that out of the article I wrote because I wanted to hide the identity of what I was talking about. Or did I? I can't remember. I haven't read it in a while. Again, wanted to end with another map. Actually, there's a second image I'll show after this. This is that characteristic area that we're talking about, which was the originally redlined area. This now became the Florence and Pueblo del Rio safety zone, which has to do with gang injunctions, meaning that you create lists of gang members and from particular gangs, and that if there's a different set of laws that apply to them in terms of walking down the street together, in terms of where they're going, and basically, long story short, it just makes it easier to arrest people. And so these safety zones, as they're called, pepper the entire city, and they're really overlaid on that alternative gang geography that I'm talking about. So there's a geography of Los Angeles that is a gang geography, and that's overlaid on this former geography of redlined spaces, which is subsequently overlaid with police data, crime data, police mapping, and surveillance. And then in tandem with that, arrest and convictions and jail time and mass incarceration. And that's roughly the kind of temporal trajectory that is interesting and I think very necessary when you're looking at the history of gangs through the lens of racial justice. Oh, I guess I didn't put in my last, hold on, let me see if I can get it really quick. I had one more screen I wanted to show you. Excuse me. This screen is about 40 days or 141 days worth of crime data. And it's from a system that's called Compstat, which is used by the LAPD. This is essentially the projects right here, all of this. So this is the Pueblo del Rio housing projects right here. And essentially, I just wanted to show you that in that time, there have been 2 homicides, one really right in the heart of the projects right here, and one sort of off to the side. So a lot of cars being stolen, a lot of assaults being reported, a lot of burglaries from cars, etc., things being stolen, etc. So robberies. So you can see, again, the clusters of data that end up accumulating in a kind of spatialized way to help us understand. Not what I'm interested in is not taking those images at a surface level, but like bringing them sort of to a deeper level and a deeper level in history so that we can look back and really begin to tease apart the origins of this, because the issue for me partly is like, okay, and then this is transitioning into stuff, and I can begin to take questions about the article if you want to talk about it. the history of if you look at it at a gang murder, if you look at gang violence, it becomes very difficult to tease out, especially when you're talking about something that's horrific. It becomes difficult to tease out the structural parts that are at play. It becomes almost impossible to divorce your understanding of murder from something that's just something happening between two people. In other words, very individualized. And so all of the rhetoric that I think has been established around gangs and the paranoia that's been established around gangs really boils gangs down to those instances of violence and kind of forces the perspective of people into a kind of one-to-one, individualized, individually rooted, way of thinking about, where does gang violence come from? Well, it comes from bad families, or it comes from morally corrupt individuals. What is the solution to that? The solution to that is you arrest those morally corrupt individuals. Maybe you evict those bad families, that you put those people away. And that's the solution to what that is. When you begin to think more structurally or historically, you have a different set of questions that emerges. And that set of questions, and I'm by no means the first person to say this, there's like structural elements to understand. And I even said most of the gang literature really thinks it has to do with deindustrialization and like loss of jobs and things like that. But gangs were really around for a long period of time prior to that. And have taken root in very specific ways, given the shape of policy. So when you begin to think about it like that, the other set of questions begins to emerge, like, oh, if we're going to actually stop activities from happening, stop like pain. Look, gang violence is painful for everyone, right? It's very, very painful. It's traumatic, you have to begin to ask, not how can we remove the bad seed people from this neighborhood, but how can we think about the neighborhood as having its own kind of complex history, layers of history of oppression, and also what the role of the police is as kind of co-creating what those neighborhoods end up looking like. So if you think about the HOLC map from 1939 as a form of surveillance, and then you flash forward and you look at the way that neighborhoods have been surveilled and controlled from the very inception of this stuff, right? Until now, that kind of begets a different set of questions. So my own experience in gang neighborhoods has been that I have met some of the most incredible people, people that I have grown immensely close to. I have witnessed and been part of and accompanied people through immense forms of suffering that have to do with eviction, that have to do with mass incarceration, and that have to do with gang violence, and that have to do with police violence too. All those things end up kind of being kind of clustered together. So knowing what I know about people and about the people who I know in particular always led me to believe that systems of police surveillance and crime fighting were not the road to public safety. Far from it. In fact, what I saw and what my whole second book was about was massive, massive damage that was being caused by conventional criminal justice systems at the community level and the family level. If you're going to be talking about how weakness in families is a core root of crime, then stop putting people in prison, because putting people in prison is creating massive amounts of weakness in families because of how you're messing with the structure of the family unit, essentially. And it's so, mass incarceration has so shifted the terms on which families are created in certain communities that are like gang heavy, police heavy, that you have ratios. And this is just a gross way of looking at it, right? You have ratios of male to female that might be like 3 females to 1 male. And I'm talking about people. We're not talking about a species of cat or something. They're people forming families, okay? And there's constant shifting, constant, navigation of fields that are like, I guess, unstable, And so how do you find and do something that's different? That led me to think a lot and read a lot about restorative justice. Like, what are the alternatives to conventional systems of thinking about, punitive systems and retributive justice? I knew it wasn't working. I have known so many people, and I still know people inside, people who are serving life, they'll never get out, one of the smartest people that I know is serving life right now. And I'm hoping that he actually will get pardoned by the governor. And I'm only saying that to say that the need for something different is palpable once you start talking to people. And it's easy to make policy from on high and like, oh, you never talk to people who are impacted directly. But my preference is to say people closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. Like, what are the other solutions? Now, people on the ground are also incredibly punitive in terms of thinking about like, what are the solutions? You got to put those people away. But there's a kind of middle ground there where people know how incredibly damaging both gang violence is and mass incarceration. They know the police are contributing to gang violence. How do you treat that? How do you deal with that? To me, what you have to do is really reconceptualize what you mean by public safety. You completely have to change that from a top-down project to something that's more laterally construed, the fabric of strong neighborhoods. And let me just point out to you, and I'm going to finish up here so we can ask questions, right? Is this pretty good timing to stop talking? I'm going to finish up by talking about abolition, okay, which I am a prison abolitionist. I am also a police abolitionist, okay? And before Black Lives Matter, if you said you were a prison abolitionist, that was like, yeah, people, it's kind of radical, but people could get behind it, right? If you ever said you were a police abolitionist, which I have done on many occasions, people would be like, that's too far. That's too much. Now people get it. Like, now people are like, yes, we kind of understand police abolition, right? The point is, a lot of the time, okay, here's one point. One point is, even for people who it's a stretch to conceive of prison abolition, the answer is in a book by Paul Butler, which is, God, I can't remember what it's called. It's the one about hip hop and prison abolition. I'll get the title when we're talking. But at the end of that book, he says, we already pretty much have prison abolition. Like, if you're white and middle class, you kind of already live in a place that has prison abolition. In other words, if my kid gets into trouble with drugs, if my kid gets into a car accident and like hurts someone, people don't necessarily think that, oh, he should go to prison, right? Like, am I safe in my neighborhood because there are police around my neighborhood? No, that's not the reason. It's because I live in a middle class neighborhood, and I live, in a neighborhood where I know my neighbors, and we keep each other safe by watching what's happening in the neighborhood. Like, that's the fabric of the neighborhood, at least that I live in. It's a function of race and class. It's less a function of race. I happen to live in a really diverse neighborhood, but it is a function of class. And people often push back and say, well, in poor neighborhoods, you could never do that. Well, you could, if you were to say, instead of focus on policing, focus on how to build neighborhoods that are healthy and safe, and how to build wealth, and how to build the fabric of of neighborhoods that then can function in these lateral ways. Because in the projects, believe me, the eyes on the street are all there. You know, everybody knows each other's business. You know, you can't make out on a corner with somebody without your mom hearing about it, like really quick from someone else. So the fabric of the neighborhood is even stronger, quite frankly, than in an average middle-class neighborhood. So I think that all of those things are in place, and that we just need to think about asking different questions about what it means to create public safety, or to think about, to reconceptualize our feeling about public safety, our understanding of public safety as not being a top-down project. It's a project of the neighborhood itself, interwoven into the fabric of the neighborhood. How do you get there? One of the ways is through different means of justice that, instead of shoving people out, bring people back in and truly hold them accountable, which is restorative or transformative justice. So that's, I think, what I will say for today. And I'd be happy to, I know there's a bit of a whirlwind. I wanted to show you that historical data. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the article that I wrote, or about anything else.
Let's give it up for Susan. Yay!
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that. I definitely learned so much. So we want to open it up to people from our class first to ask questions, if anyone has any, and then we'll open it up to the broader group.
Yeah, Glenn Rice is a public defender. So fighting the good fight, Glenn, still part of the system. And he used to work at Camp Afflerbach Page. Anyway. Oh, I see, that's to me personally. Oh, well. Sorry I outed you, Glenn. Okay, so how do you build a community without implementing a form of community policing? Can you point to any resources that talk about building this type of framework in our own communities? I think, you know, one of the ways that, yeah, I mean, you can build jobs, you know, like honestly, when I started Huerta del Valle, like when I was directing Ontario, I never actually pursued a project that had to do with gangs. You know, I could have easily done that in Ontario, and I never did. And what I did instead was Huerta del Valle. So think about, what are the neighborhood resources where people can come together, where they can be healthy, where they can eat healthy food, and actually you create public safety by doing that. So in terms of community policing is actually a term that's a little bit different, but I understand how you're using it here. It's actually a formal kind of policing that is tied to funding and so forth globally, and is part of the spread of surveillance. In terms of place-based types of interventions, there's like the $1 Million Block Project in New York. There's different models for, yes, how to, and this is essentially what people are talking about in Minneapolis and places where they're talking about defunding the police. Where do you put the money, right? And there's a lot of pushback to the idea, oh, you should give it to social workers because police are having to do the jobs of social workers anyway. But there's people on the ground who are doing this work trying to envision where the money should go. You know what I mean? Like they're trying to say on the ground. I mean, it's not for me to decide, it's for each community to decide. So there's kind of like asset development, you know, types of approaches where you go, okay, what are the assets of this neighborhood and how can we capitalize on them? What are your personal assets and how can you capitalize on them? That's sort of like the asset-based approach that maybe Tessa has been teaching you about. And that's probably not the answer that you wanted to hear, but I do think that it's really important to think, in the way that I think about it sometimes, is you get locked into a kind of one-to-one combative thing between, you know, two different sides of an issue, when really the answer sometimes is totally outside of that. So I think that the best way to tackle gangs is not to actually do much about them. Like certainly there's public safety concerns and all that, but it's actually to create healthier neighborhoods. And so that's the project. That's what you should be focused on. And when there are problems, you know, with young gang members, for example, if you do things more along the lines of, and in Oakland, they have this, and they have this all over in New Zealand, every youth offender is funneled through restorative justice process instead of retributive justice process. And the point of that process is not to shove them out into a prison that's going to teach them how to be a better criminal and to create networks and to divorce them from their family life and their development. Quite honestly, their socio-emotional development. When you go to prison, it's completely shifted. And when you go to prison as a kid, it is stunted, you know, and it's horrible. It's like horrible how that happens to people. So in that sense, thinking about alternative pathways for youth offenders in particular is really critically important at the same time as you're building other kinds of systems that create like healthier communities, that we invest in neighborhoods in a different way, you know, instead of investing with them in a law enforcement way, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it is so easy. Rosalina with, okay, so he's saying your dad is a youth offender and is serving life. The point is to look back at your dad's life and to see how easy it would have been to create a different pathway for him. If the right kinds of systems and opportunities had been in place, it's actually not that hard. You know, there are some hard parts of gangs, and some of them have to do with ego. They fill that hole. Some of them have to do with like a certain kind of collective identity that you just don't get in our society. You don't get it unless you're in a gang. It has to do with fraternity and brotherhood and these deep feelings. And like, it is powerful. And if there's a positive benefit to gangs, that's it. It is, you're so locked into like what that sense of belonging is in a way that I think all of us in this room can envy in that part of gangs. Like to have that kind of deep belonging is very, very unusual in our society. And they have that. And so that gets to be, I think, its own kind of draw. For some people, the ego of it gets to be the thing that keeps them coming back. Like they get addicted to that, you know, and like, where can they really be in charge? Well, it's on the prison yard, or where can they, you know, like you get acclimated into that life. And so anyway, that's the kind of, I guess that's, yeah, but I thank you for sharing that, Rosalina, because I think it does make it clear. And I've known so many youth offenders who, because they were sent to like, you know, Herman G. Stark, or, you know, the youth prison at Ione, or they were, you know, sentenced as an adult at age 15, they never had a chance to live a normal life. They never had a chance to get an education. You're literally throwing lives away. And in doing so, you're creating more public safety problems because people then come out underprepared. The only networks they have are other gang members or other folks who are incarcerated. And that's what they end up, you know, identifying with, learning, you know, the social mores, and from it the whole system is just completely, it is toxic from top to bottom. So that's exactly why I don't believe in that particular kind of system. Thank you for your comment, Violet. Are there any other questions? Can I talk about the scale of social justice work, the level of Huerta versus county versus state versus national, how emergent social justice work has scaled up and when it's best scaled down due to ego, personalities, differences, and how we can unite given the current toxicity? That's a very multi-layered question, Violet. You know, social justice work, here's how I'm going to answer it. And I'm going to answer it through the lens of the article that you read, that I wrote. Maybe you didn't read it, Violet, but one of the things that I think happened is that gang members and communities in gang heavy neighborhoods, you know, and Black people in general, okay? And I'm not just talking about Black people, it's also a huge Latino issue. Those folks already knew, you know, and they've been living with horrific police violence, you know, for decades, you know, centuries, right? We all know that the inception of the police is through slave patrols, right? So that the police really is about policing things other than crime. And we know that crime rates and rates of incarceration do not match. They have never matched. They don't map onto each other because crime rates are always about policing other things. They're about policing status. And a lot of the time the status has to do with race and class. So in this sense, I think some of the discourses that have been active and pervasive in gang neighborhoods for decades are just finally visible, you know, to a much broader sector of the public. And so in that visibility, luckily, we're in a very particular time where people are actually in solidarity with that message, which is, you know, it happened actually very quickly with the Black Lives Matter movement, if you think about it. So to me, that is a potency that, because of the mixing of you know, the sort of multiracial, multi-class solidarity that has formed, that has scaled up the movement. That said, I think that the movement is not a centralized movement, right? It's not centralized. And so the times to scale things down are when a movement is centralized and you have a toxic leader, which you could say that white supremacy is that. White supremacy is actually quite decentralized, but the toxic leader is Donald Trump. So there's certain ways of thinking about how even an ideological leader like Trump has that. Antifa has no such figure. There's no such hero. Bernie is not that hero. So I would just say that it's the greater visibility. He's a hero to me, but I'm saying he's not. There is no equivalent of Donald Trump in Antifa. Yeah, that's not really an answer to the question. I think that the thing I would say in response to it, though, Violet, is people, all of these systems are peopled. There's people in them. There's no such thing as government, state, county. It's Glenn, you know, as a public defender enacting that role. You know, it's this police officer enacting that role. Like, it's all peopled, and you have certain things that exist in policy, but they're flawed because they're all made up of people. And so I think that I personally am a big fan of decentralized social movements and decentralized social groups, which is one reason I really like looking at gangs, because if you think about and also I guess I'll leave it with a world beyond capitalism, right? So a world beyond capitalism, how do you envision what that world is? Who lives in a way outside of the capitalist system? Gangs actually live outside of it. They've created a separate kind of world. And there's a handful of folks that have done that. And they're all very interesting case studies. And the way they do leadership is very different. It's not corporate. You know, so there's like lots of structural things that you can talk about. Anyway, I think I'm violating my time now.
I think we are just about done. If anyone has any like burning last question or comment they want to make, we have a minute left.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes, please.
So, Susan, I was wondering if you could just talk briefly about the effects of gentrification on gang neighborhoods. You know, up here in Seattle and the Northwest, there's a lot of neighborhoods that were formerly full of people of color that are, you know, for years that were the product of redlining that are now highly sought after because real estate in this area is valuable. And I understand there's the same sort of thing going on in Southern California with the cost of living being very high. Do you see gangs being priced out of neighborhoods, or, you know, essentially, do you foresee any sort of exporting of gangs to different places, like what we saw with MS and El Salvador and that sort of thing. I guess if you could speak on that for a minute, I'd love to hear it. Thanks.
Yeah. Gentrification is a really hot button issue in Los Angeles, and part of the reason that it gets a toehold is because of gangs, right? So gangs can be, and those gang injunctions, that the map that I showed you, those maps actually can pave the way in, and have in places like Echo Park, pave the way for gentrification to take place. So there's always two things at play in any given society that are nefarious, and they often work together. One is security, and the other is investment. And the two things go hand in hand. You see this globally. So if you have a place that is insecure, it's not a safe, and again, this goes back to the redlining discussion, it's not a safe place to invest. If you can make it secure, you can make it safe to invest there, okay? And that's essentially one role. Again, like I said before, what role does policing have? What is it actually policing? It's actually, in a sense, contributing to these, the ability of places to gentrify, right? So that is a real palpable thing in Los Angeles. Certainly the place where Tessa is from, in Venice, you could say, total transformation of Venice from pretty hardcore, like gang area, to like, wow, okay. Now, are there gangs still in Venice? Yeah, there's some gang members in Venice, but very, very minimal, very decreased. Same with Echo Park, same with Frogtown, Atwater Village. There's lots of places where gangs have formally been running the streets, and now it's real estate. Sometimes large-scale developments, the construction of apartments and so forth. Sorry if I froze there for a minute. But then sometimes the sort of smaller scale household level transformation that comes along with Highland Park, same thing. There's still gangs in Highland Park, but and they're trying to make Boyle Heights the area that doesn't happen. The amount of like pushback. So yeah, there's some interesting dynamics there, Glenn, and they're very, very palpable. And yes, they have everything to do with race. And then if you look at the pattern of them, again, it's security and investment, all the way down the line. You could look at the history of gangs through those two things. And you can even look at the history of gangs globally through those two things. It happens all over the world. So, and the security tends to be the form of like punitive, retributive, them taking, 1988 California gang legislation and importing it into South Africa because they want to make South Africa safe to invest. Same goddamn thing. Like, again, it's just like replicated all over the world. The flip side of that is restorative justice, also spreading all over the world. So you can look at an alternative map, the way that you can look at an alternative cartography of gangs, you can look at an alternative map of how to deal differently with crime. And that has to do, and even if you define it as crime, that has to do with restorative justice, which comes out of New Zealand and Fresno, not London and New York, the way zero tolerance policing does. It comes out of Fresno, California, Mennonites, and New Zealand, indigenous practices. And all of those things have actually spread and have a different mapping trajectory as well. So I hope I covered everything I was supposed to cover, but I really appreciate the
I think, Susan, you did a beautiful job, and I think you covered a lot from gangs to policing to community to neighborhoods to understanding the impacts of surveillance and economics and all of the different things that impact a community. And then, of course, the other side of things of what we can do for more of that healing justice, restorative justice, disrupting the systems that have been so pervasive and harmful. And I appreciate you being able to bring us both so beautifully. And I really encourage folks to Susan sometimes teaches classes on prisons and at CGU and at Pitzer, and if she does, I encourage you to take them. And yeah, anyways, I just really appreciate your time and energy, Susan, so much.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for running this beautiful program with these students. It's wonderful to see and engage with them.